Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 73, Tall Tales,
where we tackle the entire genre of fantasy in one episode.
No, we did want to do a fantasy episode, but we realized that is just such a broad concept that we kind of picked this little kind of niche subset of films, which there are actually quite a few of, these films that are structured around a story being told. And we have three different movies that kind of tackle that idea in three pretty distinct ways.
Yeah, we're all. It actually gets a little meta this week. And by little meta, I mean very meta. And we're going to get all into like fundamentals of storytelling and why it's important and all of that great talk. So strap in and get ready because we're talking about stories again, y'all. Fantasy stories.
Stories about stories. Stories within stories within stories.
Which is important. I mean, that's like the basic way that we remember and communicate information have done since the dawn of time.
Yeah, I mean, even going back to the Odyssey, like a good chunk of the Odyssey is a story that Odysseus is telling himself. And the fact that the Odyssey was originally a verbal tale that was told orally. So, you know, this is history.
Yeah, right. I mean, the best way to communicate information is to wrap it up in this story nugget, story pill of sorts. Helps it stick in your mind. We love stories at a fundamental level. And all stories, to a certain extent, that aren't documentary are fantasy stories. They are dealing with the concept beyond reality, which is what fantasy is. Even if that's just something on a slightly different version of reality. I mean, even something like Seinfeld is kind of a fantasy in that it's an exaggerated form of reality.
Right.
And then we're going all the way to stuff like Lord of the Rings, which is full-blown fantasy where somebody completely invents a world and it's totally different.
Yeah, and these kind of fantastical worlds and things are, you know, we can create and we can enjoy them, but they also have... It's a way of commenting on true reality. It's in a way of letting us just see things in a different way. It's not that these stories are completely irrelevant. They actually have true implications. They're just not something that maybe could factually happen in real life.
Yeah. And that's the entertaining thing about stories. That's the narrative hook, right? That's the thing that interests us as an audience and gets us involved. And then, I mean, what we've been studying so far in this podcast is the way to pack all those stories with all of the good stuff that teaches and educates and makes you emotional, makes you feel, and expands your worldview, all behind this easy to digest pill capsule of a story.
Miracle pill.
That seems oddly relevant. Is that from one of our films today, Jonathan?
Yeah, who knew? So our first film is probably the most famous, most well-known and beloved of the fantasy stories about telling stories, and that is Rob Reiner's The Princess Bride from 1987. For more on Rob Reiner, check out episode 62 on mockumentaries, because we talked about his breakout film, This is Spinal Tap. So this movie is based on a book of the same name by William Goldman, who is a fantastic writer, both novelist and screenwriter, and he both wrote the book for this film and adapted it into the film. And at the Oscars, this was only nominated for one, which is Best Original Song, which is that song in the credits.
Which doesn't strike me as super duper distinctive when I'm kind of removed from the film, but when I'm actually watching the film and it comes on, then yeah.
It feels really like natural, like it's just like, okay, yeah, that's how this movie ends, like every time, like especially for such a film that's so nostalgic and it has so many memories, like whenever you hear that song, you're like, oh man, that just kind of hits me in the nostalgia.
And the next film we're going to talk about is Big Fish from 2003, which is directed by Tim Burton. And if you want to learn more about Tim Burton, go see last week's episode where I might or might not have had a fever the entire time.
Sorry about that.
This one was nominated for Best Original Score by Danny Elfman, of course, because he's fantastic. And all of his work with Tim Burton just pairs phenomenally well. And it's perfect Oscar material.
Absolutely. And our final film is The Fall, directed by Tarsem, who doesn't have a long list of movie credits. I think he's done more work in the advertising realm. But this is based on the 1981 Bulgarian film Yo Ho Ho, which I just found out about this week while doing research on this movie. And that's very interesting. And the actress, the little girl actress in the film is Bulgarian. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to The Fall.
But first, let us talk about Princess Bride. Jason is going to set that one up for us.
The Princess Bride from 1987. A young boy in modern Chicago is stuck sick in bed when his grandfather comes to visit. Against the boy's initial resistance, the grandfather starts to read him a book, The Princess Bride. The story is all about a beautiful young woman named Buttercup and a handsome Douglas Fairbanks-type farmhand named Wesley, who fall desperately in love. Whenever Buttercup asks something of Wesley, he simply responds, "As you wish." Through a series of misfortunate circumstances, the two are separated and reunited, along with a kindly giant, a vengeful Spaniard, an inconceivable Sicilian, a six-fingered count, and a dastardly villainous king. As the adventure continues, the lovers try desperately to reach each other and escape their foes. Meanwhile, the young boy sick in Chicago slowly grows used to the kissy parts as he becomes as enthralled in the story as we are.
All right, so as you can tell, this is a story within a story that is also a story. And that kind of sets up this meta perspective of the film and this commentary of this young boy who's going to be learning to like stories that he didn't think he could like over the course of the film.
In a new medium, in a new way.
Yeah, in a new medium, in a new way, which is kind of the arc of the actual film itself, even though we have this story happening up front with the Princess Bride and the Dread Pirate William Robinson, or not William Robinson.
Roberts.
Just Roberts. I don't know why I want to say William Robinson every time. Anyway, although that certainly is a fascinating and interesting tale, but what that tale feels like it's doing in the film is presenting all of the typical things that we love about story in an exaggerated manner, not really parodizing them, more of a pastiche, which is like a parody, but instead of making fun of it, it's celebrating the wackiness of a thing. So kind of a pastiche of a typical fantasy story, exaggerating all of these features that we love: the romance, the swashbuckling, the dastardly villain with six fingers.
Whom Christopher Guest just literally disappears into.
Yeah, no, it's really weird to think that that's Christopher Guest.
I watched Spinal Tap and I watched Princess Bride, and I'm like, no, this is a different person. I actually was watching a little bit of the movie with Rob Reiner's commentary on, and he said that at one of the cast parties, Rob Reiner was there and he saw Christopher Guest, and he was like, "Oh, hey, that's nice for Chris to come out and support the movie." And he was like, "Oh yeah, he was in the movie."
Yep. So lots of stories to come out of the production of this film. I would recommend reading As You Wish by Carrie Ewells. Very good book, goes into the making of this movie. Fascinating set of people who made it. But back to this pastiche concept. The center of the film, the core of the film, the story is this pastiche, this exaggeration, this celebration of all these things we love about story, wrapped up with this young boy learning to love all of those things about stories. And even at the start of the film, he doesn't think he's going to like the kissing parts. He asks his dad to skip over it, but by the end, he wants to hear even those parts of the story.
Yeah, and the way that the way that all of these films work is we kind of set up and get into the story, and then there are these little breaks throughout where we go back and forth between the storyteller and the hearer and the actual story that is being told. And this one has the least of those interjections, but the ones that we get kind of have their own character arc, and it's really kind of amazing because we start off with Fred Savage. You know, he's like, oh, it's a book. You know, he starts off playing a video game, and you know he's not very interested in that kind of story. It takes too long, but his grandfather's like, I'm gonna read you this story. He's like, okay, fine. And as we go, we get to see him just kind of getting more and more enthralled whenever the grandfather stops at the part with the shrieking eels, and he's like, whoa, wait, what? What's gonna happen? And then by the end, when like the ultimate end of the character arc, when he asks the grandfather to go back and read them kissing at the very end. So yeah, as much as there is like character arcs and drama and stuff within the story, there is that arc outside of the story as well. You know, everyone kind of can remember that experience or has had that experience where they're like, oh man, somebody recommended this to me. I don't know. I guess I'll try it. And then you just fall in love with it. And then, and you want to hear it again and again. Like he says at the end, like maybe you can come back and read it again tomorrow.
Yeah. No, it is a brilliantly structured story. It was a very popular book that William Goldman wrote. And he wrote the screenplay for it as well. But this was a film that languished in development hell for the longest time. No one could figure out a good way to do it. And then along came Rob Reiner, who had basically, after the success of Spinal Tap, had carte blanche with all of these different indie producers who just wanted to let him make a movie so that he could make them money.
Which is also a recurring theme we've seen on this podcast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So he wanted to do The Princess Bride, and even then, after the success of Spinal Tap, people were a little resistant to let him do it, but he talked him into it, and thankfully he did, because this is a fantastic movie. Speaking of William Goldman, do you mind if I tell a quick William Goldman anecdote, Jonathan?
Go for it. So, this is an episode about stories. Tell all the anecdotes you want. So
on the set of The Princess Bride, when they were shooting... one of the first scenes they shot was the fire swamp. And as you know, there is a scene where Buttercup, Robin Wright's character's dress catches on fire. Well, William Goldman is a writer. He was on set. He's also a very nervous fellow. So he was having problems even just being on set. Like he was freaking out, so he would leave and come and go and come and go. And if you didn't know, one of the things you do before a big stunt in Hollywood is gather the whole, and this is mandatory, you gather the whole cast and crew together and you talk everybody through the stunt. Everybody knows exactly what's going to happen, all of the safety precautions, all of the backup precautions. If something goes wrong, this is what you do, yada, 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 yada. Well, William Goldman, having one of his anxiety attacks, wasn't on set for that. But he did come back in time for the first take, in which Robin's dress catches on fire. Everybody's going about their business because this is normal. And he goes, "Oh my God, Robin!" and jumps on set and tackles her, trying to put out the fire. Needless to say, this was resolved, but he was he was a little embarrassed by it. In fact, he was so embarrassed that later on, a few scenes down the line in the fire swamp, they were trying to shoot a scene, but they were hearing this weird noise and they couldn't figure out what it was. So they started searching the set and they found William Goldman hiding behind some of the set dressing, just talking to himself and trying to reassure himself that everything was A-okay. I kind of feel bad for the guy, but like it was just kind of like the perfect tempo setter for this production. Yeah.
And we should talk about kind of the elements of the story within the story because it is very exciting. This is, I kind of have different categories for the different ways that the stories function in each of these movies. And this one is kind of just purely stories as entertainment. The story has so much drama and and stuff like the grandfather says at the beginning when he's trying to sell the book to him. Fencing, fighting, giants, revenge, true love. It's got, I mean, this story has everything in it. It's kind of like your classic swashbuckling film, your Robin Hoods, your pirates. You've got everything in this movie just to make it kind of hit all the notes for everybody to love it. And that's one of the reasons why it is so beloved. But you've got this great cast of characters. You've got Wallace Shawn, Mandy Patinkin, Andre the Giant, of course, Carrie Yules and Robin Wright. And I think most of them were not very well known at this point because the film had a very limited budget, so they couldn't get big stars or anything. But they all just kind of knock it out of the park, and they all have kind of the perfect look and the perfect dynamic to just kind of transport you to this time and place that you feel like from other stories, but yet it's all completely fantastical.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And, of course, this story is very much about learning to love stories. But I think
William Goldman makes it easy for you.
Yeah, and I think it transcends that a little bit in the meta storyline, the Chicago storyline that's happening outside of the fantasy story itself. The young boy, Fred Savage, is sick at the beginning, and he finds that he feels better over the course of experiencing the story. And maybe slightly larger than that is the fact that he doesn't really want to see his grandpa at the start of this. He's like, oh, no, grandpa's here. He's going to come pinch my cheek. And then by the end, he's like, oh, okay. No, this story's brought us together. It's got the power to kind of do things that you wouldn't think that just words are capable of doing, like make you feel better when you're ill, or make you feel closer to a fellow family member that you didn't think you could feel closer to, all sorts of stuff. And that's definitely a smaller part of this film. A lot of this is about entertainment, but I just wanted to throw that out there as a stories are something that connect to us and have power beyond just their face value.
Yeah, absolutely. And another element to that we're going to talk about with all three of these films, and especially The Fall, though, is this element, like you were talking about. Words have this kind of power to bring people together because you're having this shared experience of imagining this story. And yet in a film, you can't just imagine it. You have to show it. And so that's another interesting way that each of these films kind of tackles that idea of showing what is the imagination and whose perspective is it coming from. In Princess Bride and Big Fish, it's kind of it's a little bit more of an objective, like, this is how the story is going, and so this is how it looks and stuff. But still, we're going inside of Fred Savage's imagination as he's experiencing the story. So it's important that you kind of get as close as you can to full imagination, which is never totally possible on film. But I think that these movies do a really good job of attempting to create this vision and this world that is as wonderful and as exciting as it would be if you were reading the words and coming up with it in your own mind. And another thing about the story that makes it so approachable and lovable is that even though it is a completely original story, it kind of takes a lot of elements from classic fairy tales. And we're talking about that with Big Fish too. We talked about that last time with Edward Scissorhands. But, it has things like giants and miracle workers and kings and princesses and stuff like that. Like all of these things that are just kind of like common human, at least Western experiences of great stories and fantastical stories from the classic fairy tales all the way to today. So you kind of take a bunch of those elements, kind of throw them in a melting pot, put William Goldman's just wonderful dialogue and scenarios together, and you have this movie that I'm going to be showing my kids, and I hope lives on for much longer than that too. Yeah.
Did you know what was written in the screenplay when it got to the sword fighting scene between the Dread Pirate Roberts and Inigo Montoya?
No, I hope that it's something Shakespeare-ish, like they fight.
It says the greatest sword fight in the history of cinema.
Oh yeah, I think I have heard that. That's hilarious.
Yep.
And William Goldman talks about how he kind of researched a lot of sword fighting language and stuff like that because they have that whole dialogue throughout that sword fight, which is, in my opinion, probably the greatest sword fight in cinema.
It's good. It's real good.
And it's both them. There's like 2 stunt shots when they're flipping, but as Rob Reiner says, every frame of them actually sword fighting is them.
Yeah.
And I believe
They trained really hard for it too. Again, read about it in As You Wish by Cary Elwes.
I believe that was Bob Anderson as Swordmaster on that film, right?
Yeah, it was one of the guys who had been around the block like a million times.
Yeah, 'cause Bob Anderson did Star Wars, he did Lord of the Rings, he did Pirates of the Caribbean, I think. I mean, pretty much all the classic great sword fighting movies.
I think he was one of the guys who did sword fighting training on like the last Robin Hood movie to happen. Before this
was that
one.
Kevin Costner?
I think so. I feel like that. Yes, I feel like that's true. But they were
awesome.
like the best two. They had 2 instructors, and they were 2 of the best instructors in Hollywood. Had been doing all of the sword fighting in movies for decades.
Well, it paid off. I think Rob Reiner in the commentary was saying that the fight between Inigo and Count Rugen at the end is probably more kind of technically masterful, but this one is just so much more exciting. And you have like character arcs within a sword fight. You have them trying to go easy on each other because they respect each other, and then trying to go harder because they're still trying to win, and then still losing and still having that respect for each other on Inigo's side, and the respect that Wesley has to not kill him, where he says, "I'd sooner destroy a stained glass window as an artist such as yourself." It's just you have a character arc within a sword fight. That is good storytelling.
Yeah, there's a lot of knocking people out with the butt end of a sword in this movie.
Yeah.
And in fact, the time when Count Rugen knocks out Wesley, that was a slip up. That was actually him knocking him out.
Oh no.
Yeah. Like they couldn't get it just right. They couldn't get it just right. And then on the final take, like somebody was slightly out of position, and whack,
no.
And Cary Elwes gets whacked on the head, and just those eyes rolling back in his head. That was happening. He actually got hurt just a whole bunch on this movie.
Yeah, he had like a twisted ankle or something from a ATV accident or something like that.
Yeah, that he tried to hide. Tried to hide on set because he was a new actor and he was scared he was going to lose his job. And Rob Reiner was like, no, that's not how this works. Go get healthy. We'll make the movie when you're healthy.
Yeah. So anyway, we can go on forever about this movie. We both love it, and if you haven't seen it, you're missing out. So go check it out. But now on to our second film,
Big Fish from 2003. Will Bloom has never had a well-defined relationship with his father, but then again his father, Edward, has never really had a well-defined relationship with reality. The film starts at Will's wedding party, where Edward steals the spotlight by telling the tall tale of trying to catch a big fish with his wedding ring. This isn't the first time Will has heard Edward stretch a story, and it isn't the first time he's used it to take the focus of a night away from Will. This time, though, Will has had enough and doesn't speak to his father again for 3 years. After those 3 years, Will receives a phone call that his father is dying of cancer, and so Will flies home with his wife to see Ed again, perhaps for the last time. As Will tries to understand who his father really is, we dig into the meat of the film, a retelling of Ed's life, as told by Ed. A series of time-jumping tall tales take us from young Ed meeting a witch in the woods to adult Ed meeting a giant, a werewolf, a mystical mystery town, the woman of his dreams, and so much more. Through it all, the audience is left in awe trying to decipher what really happened, what Edward just made up, and how much any of that really matters.
So in this film, kind of the way that I categorize the story is, story as embellishment. It has that kind of autobiographical element to it, where we have Albert Finney's character telling the story of his life, but embellishing it to such an extent that his son starts to not believe him. And he has this sort of disillusionment with the story, and his character arc throughout the film is trying to learn that his father was not necessarily lying to him as he suspected, but just kind of put enough flair on it that he wouldn't have he wouldn't seem to have a boring life. I think is kind of what it boils down to. Because his ambition and his imagination is so much bigger than that. But there's so many layers that go into it, between the father telling the stories to the son about to become a father himself, the stories that are told within the father's stories. And another really interesting element of this movie is the way that we transition from the storytelling into the story, because there were several times that we would be in the quote unquote flashback, and I'd be like, wait a second, how did we get here? I don't even remember what was happening back in the real world per se. And so in that respect, it kind of has this dreamlike quality to it.
Yeah, certainly. And this is a very complex movie that says a lot about storytelling.
It says a lot about a lot. It's actually very, very insightful.
It is. And one of the things that works at the core of this movie is that there's a million different ways to interpret a story that's being told, and the reasons that's being told for, and the person telling it, and so on and so forth. So it lives in this space of uncertainty and this kind of hard to grasp, quicksilverish nature of it. It's a bit fluid in how it exists, and just starting at like a structural level, like it bops all over the freaking place. There's like 3 or 4 actors for each of the main actors because they all have to be played at different ages. And it moves fluidly through all of that and somehow stays coherent, which is a pretty impressive mark of storytelling on Tim Burton's part and the screenwriter's part, who I don't know if that's Tim Burton off the top of my head. Probably not.
No, it's actually John August.
There you go.
He has a podcast called Script Notes, if anyone is interested in listening to him talk about script writing.
We've probably mentioned him before.
Yeah.
But yes, this is an intensely complicated film, and this might be, like you said, this might be the dad, just making his story seem bigger. I mean, even the title, Big Fish, comes from the idea of, and this, I guess this works better if you could see my hands right now, but the story of I caught a fish this big to I caught a fish this big to I got a fish this big. It's so easy to, every time you tell that, slip your hands a little bit farther apart until they're wide apart and you've just got this big fish where really you just caught a little tiny guppy. So maybe the father is lying, and at a certain fundamental level, all storytelling is lying. You are telling something that isn't true. Fantasy is by definition not reality, and therefore is something that is not true. It is something that is false. But it is something to be enjoyed and something that can communicate something more complex about reality than the simple documentary relation of facts can.
Yeah, and that kind of, there's the scene where the son kind of sits down with his dad and he says, I just want you to tell me something true. You've only ever told me amusing lies. He kind of reframes what the dad calls stories as amusing lies. And the dad's like, he's like, I just want you to be who you are. And he says, I've never been anything but who I am since the day I was born. And that's kind of what the son has to start realizing, is that these stories, even though they're not true in their particulars, they are true in their essence. And the point of everything that he told kind of is still there, regardless of whether he actually fought a werewolf or not, or whatever. But so for example, if you take the story of how he finally caught his big fish and got his wedding ring back on the day that his son was born, and you kind of take it on a more metaphorical level, I mean, you can kind of see it as that kind of saving his marriage when his son is born, because there becomes this sort of up in the air quality of whether or not he was having an affair, whether or not he was spending enough time at home and stuff like that. So you kind of have to take all the stories that he tells and delve a little bit deeper into them and see what it's saying about him rather than what it's saying on its face.
Yeah, and I think the stories, I think they show more how the father character views the world around him more than they describe what actually happened, because I mean they are pretty far from the truth. Although we see at the end that maybe they're not.
Not as far as we would think, yeah.
Not as far as we can think. There's always a kernel of truth in there. But I think it's the truth that that the son is so desperately seeking for about his father is the way that his father sees the world. At least I think it is. And I think the way that his father sees the world is communicated best by seeing the stories and being able to see what the foundation of each of those stories is, and see the changes that the father made to each of the stories to embellish them, because that's what the father holds as important, holds as interesting, views as important about himself, views as important about himself to other people, so on and so forth. You could keep going on and on and on. But I also want to talk about the fact that the son is a reporter.
Oh yeah, I didn't think the son. I know the son's wife is a reporter.
Oh yeah,
I didn't realize he was a reporter as well.
They're both reporters. She's a photographic journalist, and he is just a journalist in Paris.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I didn't even think about it on that level, but to that extent, his job is to tell stories, but to tell stories with as much factuality and fidelity as possible, which kind of heightens that disconnect that he feels with his father's stories. And I think, like you were saying, that the stories, I feel like when we're in the flashbacks, the storytelling of the father, it's more subjective from the father's point of view. It's kind of, we're seeing the world as he sees it, again, in that way of being able to having film be a medium to project imagination into the imagination of the audiences. And of course, Tim Burton is kind of a perfect director to do that. As we talked about last week, he is such a fantastical mind, and the ways that he's able to just kind of create, again, all of these fairy tale elements, the witches and the giants and the, this kind of spectral city, pun intended, and all of these different elements, because this movie goes through so many. This is extremely fluid in terms of its structure and also in terms of its style and its genre, because it kind of pays homage to a lot of different genres. It'll go from bank heist movie to a horror in the woods movie to all of these different things, and it shifts between them so fluidly. The movie doesn't have kind of a set look because it's kind of grasping at all of these different aesthetics, and it makes it really entertaining. But the other element to the big fish in the title is the big fish in the little pond. This idea that his ambition and his imagination is way too big for the town that he's in, so he has to leave and he goes on all these adventures. And I think it's also kind of true of just himself. His imagination is bigger than his life is, and so I think that his stories are a way of kind of making his life seem larger than maybe it was in reality. And there might be some insecurity in that he can't really admit that maybe he didn't do kind of the greatest thing in the world. But and to that extent, I kind of see a little bit of a It's a Wonderful Life quality to this movie, except in a kind of flipped way in which maybe he didn't have the greatest life or the most adventurous life, but instead of kind of coping with it, he kind of just takes his own life and magnifies it just to make it a little bit closer to the life that he wanted in retrospect.
Yeah, and the things that he's doing over the course of the film are things that we all do to some extent, one or another.
Yeah.
This is a fundamentally relatable film, not just because of our connection to stories, but the fact that we all use them. Everybody embellishes their own stories a little bit, whether they realize it or not. Even if it's just the fact that you see all of your own stories from your own point of view, and most people tend to see themselves in the best light. And that's typically how they relate the stories back. Now, not everybody might have the flair for it that Albert Finney's character does, but we all do it. And it's all about, in a way, wanting to view your life in the best way possible. And that's something that Albert Finney's character accomplishes in kind of an admirable fashion to a certain extent. He's more optimistic and more positive about his life than a lot of people. Now, the way that he reaches it is, it's got some ups and downs to it. Certainly, it seems to have messed up his kid quite a bit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the technique itself is completely terrible.
Right. You just have to have enough forthrightness about it in order to kind of not let people like your son kind of wonder, maybe this is just a cover for some really, really dark things that he was doing. But he gets answers to some of those things near the end. And then, of course, kind of approaching the end, we have to get to a little bit of spoiler territory. But the point where the son takes over the story and he finally accepts and puts himself, or rather kind of picks up the story where the father left off, and he finishes it and then carries it on. And then, of course, we have at the very end where all the people from his life are there, and they're all telling stories. And then the son's son is telling stories. And it's just this, it turns into this legacy. And that's kind of what the film leaves you with, is the fact that these stories become a legacy that can be passed down, not only to the people that you're immediately in contact with, but to generations that you've never met or will never meet.
Yeah, exactly. Like, his stories are going to live well beyond him.
Yeah. And the last thing we should touch on, because it's going to come up again a little bit in the next one, is this idea of the inconsistencies in the story. So we're getting all of these little vignettes throughout the film, almost in like a Life and Times of Colonel Blimp kind of thing, or Life and Death of Colonel Blimp kind of thing. But there are things that don't mesh, and it's not like plot holes. It's part of the story. So, for example, when the little girl from the town of Spectre that he goes to, as they say, the first time too early and the second time too late, which every like scene in this movie has this kind of fable quality to it, where Spectre is like, is it death? Is it a metaphor for complacency? It's kind of hard to, there's definitely some kind of metaphorical context there, but it's not laid out extremely flatly. But anyway, she's a little girl when he first meets her, and then she's also kind of becomes the witch in the story at the beginning when he's a little kid. And so there's some element to where that the actual woman, I think, kind of projects herself into the witch's role once she realizes that that she can't be with him, because she knows his stories too. So it doesn't, because that's the point where the son starts a little bit wrestling with the inconsistencies of the story. He's like, wait, you can't be the witch if you're also the girl from the beginning, because the age thing doesn't match up. And even though she told him that story, I think that might be her kind of projecting herself into his stories, rather than him also kind of acknowledging that she's both of those characters.
Yeah. And it kind of comments on the fact that not all stories really make sense, and adds to the weird viscous nature of the story and this guy in general. How the story kind of bends to fit the shape of the container that it's in at any given moment.
Yeah, that's
More
true.
to
And the
convey-
point that's trying to be made.
Yeah, it's more about conveying meaning or significance than it is about conveying raw fact. Raw fact doesn't really have much of a place in this movie.
Right. And it also kind of flows in with an element of memory, in that, sometimes when you're trying to grasp at two memories that happened a long time ago, even if they happened at different times, they can kind of blend themselves together a little bit. And so that kind of, that kind of like gives you that feel too, of like, there are these two memories. This element is similar in both of them, and so it's kind of hard to distinguish between them and which was actually before and which was after. All right, so with that, let's get into the last movie.
The Fall from 2006. In the early age of silent film Hollywood, an injured stuntman named Roy and a young girl with a broken arm named Alexandria meet at a hospital. The two immediately find a bond when Roy begins to tell the tale of Alexandria's namesake, Alexander the Great. We see the enactments of the tall tales the two tell together as a silent Indian warrior, an ex-slave, an Italian explosive expert, a mysterious masked bandit, and Charles Darwin seek vengeance against the evil Governor Odious. Alexandria projects these characters onto the people she meets in the hospital, while Roy struggles with his challenging recovery and shaky mental health. As reality and fantasy weave closer and closer together, choices made by the storytellers in the fantasy seem to have a larger than expected impact on their real lives. Will the heroes survive, or will the evil Governor Odious prevail?
So The Fall is a really interesting take on all this stuff that we've been talking about, because it turns the story that's being told into a sort of reward and punishment mechanism. In the way that Lee Pace's character uses the story to get the little girl, Alexandria, to basically assist him in his suicide attempts. And so that's a really interesting kind of dark take on this whole thing. So he's still using that inherent appealing quality to stories, and obviously Alexandria's imagination is ripe for it. But he uses it where we saw in The Princess Bride how those stories bring people together, and they definitely do. They start bringing them together, but it's not being done from a genuine point. And Lee Pace's character is using that to manipulate her. So it's a really, it's a really interesting take on all this, to use a story as a manipulation in this really kind of dark take.
Yeah, it kind of communicates that stories have this gripping quality to them, to their audience. It's got this value, inherent value, that we just latch onto in a way. But that power, it has this power over us. Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at. That stories have a power, and that power, like all power, can be used for good or bad. And it's used for good or bad over the course of this story. As these characters try to work through their own stuff through the story, and they end up having this extreme impact on each other by the end. The story and reality, as they kind of just end up blurring together.
Yeah, and not in the fact that, the characters kind of jump into the real world in some kind of Jim Henson-y way, but in the fact that the story becomes a common language between the two. And there is a language barrier in the film, which makes their relationship even richer between those characters. But, kind of jumping to a really dramatic point, but she starts saying, don't kill him, or don't let him die in the story. But when she's saying that, what she really means is, I don't want you to die, because they are so ingrained within this story that's being told. There is this semi-autobiographical element to it that's much more hidden than in Big Fish, but it becomes this kind of common ground for them to express their feelings to each other. And I think that's just a really powerful element of this movie.
Yeah. And on top of all of that, it's a gorgeous movie.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, this movie is kind of the best example of putting us inside of the imagination of the hearer, because we're seeing Alexandria's subjective view of the story, and we get that from the very beginning when Lee Pace is talking about one of the adventurers that's in the story who is an Indian, and she's imagining an Indian from India, but he's talking about squaws and wigwams. So obviously he's thinking about Native Americans. So they're coming from two very culturally different places, and the story still works, but it just kind of like it puts into relief this fact that we're seeing everything very subjectively from Alexandria's point of view, and other elements that are in her experience that she blends into the story that aren't necessarily spoken in words, but are presented visually. So, for example, the X-ray mask, when she sees the guy going into this movie set in like the 30s, so they have like this huge suit or whatever that I guess they had to wear for X-rays for the radiation, but it looks terrifying to a little kid. So all the bad guys are wearing that mask. And, you know, that's never part of the story that Lee Pace specifically verbalizes, but it's part of Alexandria's imagination. So that's a really cool part of this. And also just like the fact that it's all shot on location. As I said, Tarsem was mostly an advertising director. So he would only take, apparently this movie took like 6 years to make. And that's not even including a lot more time for pre-production. But he would only take advertising jobs during that time that were in really exotic locations. And while he was filming his ad campaigns there, he would fly out the cast and shoot a scene in whatever location that he was in, and kind of double dip on those productions.
Get it done when you can get it done.
Yeah, it's kind of notorious for how long and how extensive it was to film and to actually do everything on location, but it plays off gorgeously.
Yeah. And you know what I just thought of? It's kind of interesting. You know, the fantasy story that we're seeing is a story that's being told by Lee Pace's character, and then, or what's his name? Ray? Something like that?
Roy, yeah.
I'm just going to keep calling him Lee Pace anyway. What am I talking about? And then all of the visuals are stuff that's being presented by the young girl's interpretation of his story. So a big part of this film is about the reinterpretation of stories, which is something that happens even in the creation of a film between, you know, a writer who is telling the story like Roy is, and then the director who is changing it, and not just the director, the camera person, the actors, all of those people who are reinterpreting and creating the visual aspect of the story to go along with the words that go into it. And then, you know, it's just something that happens on a day-by-day basis. I mean, if the dad from Big Fish is telling the story, he's telling the story, but in each person's mind who hears that story, it exists differently. It exists in a different visual. And it's not just a passive thing that happens in the fall either. This translation and reinterpretation, it's something that becomes a clash as they fight over what the ending of the story is going to be. Yeah,
and she kind of inserts herself into the story and changes the ending. And that's another way that this story brings them together and has a real world kind of impact on their lives outside of just this this kind of bonding moment. And the other thing that kind of blends the storytelling and the imagination together is the transitions. This movie probably has my favorite transitions of any movie ever. There are so many, from the butterfly, where we're seeing a shot of kind of a what do you call it? It's not necessarily taxidermized, but where they put the butterfly on the pin and the camera kind of rotates around it, and then it fades into an island that is the exact same shape. I don't know how they did that. I mean, it's like so perfectly matched. The match fades in this film are astounding. The one where the creepy priest with the weird headdress turns into a rock formation. Like, how much time did it take to frame and kind of work the sand in order to make that fade work? I don't know, but that sticks in my mind all the time. And there are so many, from the putting the napkin on the coffee and it turns into the blood-soaked cloth. Like, I can go on and on about the style and production value of this movie. It's gorgeous. So another quick little production tidbit, aside from the locations, is the cast. And we have Katinka Untaru, who plays Alexandria. She was 6 when they filmed this, and obviously she kind of grows up a little bit throughout the filmmaking. She has teeth near the end inside the storytelling, and she doesn't have teeth in the hospital. But she is a Bulgarian actress. So in order to create, because I was watching this again with my wife this week, and we were just kind of amazed because, one of the maxims of filmmaking is never work with kids or animals, because they're so hard to manage, and it's really hard to get good child performances. But she is amazing. She's so natural in front of the camera. And one of the ways that they were able to create this really natural relationship between Lee Pace and Katinka is the fact that they had never met until they started filming. She only met many of these actors on set. And so a lot of her first reactions are real. So things like when she reads the label for morphine as MORIPHIN3. That was kind of a real reaction, and then Tarsem took that and kind of developed a whole plot point on it. And there are so many different ways of approaching actors and approaching getting genuine reactions and children, but somehow this approach worked so well. And I think another thing that they did is, for some of the scenes in the hospital bed, they would kind of close the curtains and just kind of film through a small hole so that Katinka couldn't see like the entire film crew and stuff around them. And that kind of makes her relationship with Lee Pace that much more intimate and genuine. And I think they also did things like Lee Pace would stay in the bed or in a wheelchair while on set to kind of convince her that he actually couldn't walk and stuff like that. So it's really interesting, but it works so well because her relationship with Lee Pace in this film is so moving and so genuine. And it's a really special and unique thing to be able to get that from a child actor, especially one who literally has a language barrier with the other actors on set.
And we should point out that, this entire concept of like talking about stories and storytellers and reinterpretations of stories is all set in the backdrop of like 19 teens. I don't know if
20s or 30s, I think.
So it's definitely not the 30s because it's a silent film that he's doing the stunt in. And I've seen multiple sources that say different things, and I don't know if they actually mention it in the film itself, and it could easily be either one, but I've seen like 1915 and I've seen 1925. I'm more inclined to believe 1915 just by the nature of how everything looks. But
let's say 1920 and call it even.
Anyway, it's the height of silent cinema in Hollywood. Hollywood is still kind of spread out, hence this hospital out in the middle of nowhere.
But
There's
it is
some-
in Los Angeles.
It is in the Los Angeles area. I think it might be south of LA, or maybe I'm just misinterpreting Orange County.
Yeah, I don't know. I just know that at the very beginning, there's a title card that says Los Angeles. So that's kind of all the clues that we get to where it is.
Yeah. But anyway, the entire idea is set in this backdrop of storytelling and fantasy and fakery that is Hollywood, and has already been established at this point in Hollywood's history as the capital of fantasy storytelling.
Yeah.
And Lee Pace, hurts himself doing a stunt for a movie. So the entire concept of what's going on here is set against the backdrop of filmmaking, which is thematically important, and two, makes it hopeless that you wouldn't be able to draw connections between the reflection on storytelling happening in the film and the reflection of storytelling through filmmaking itself.
Yeah. It kind of has this, this element of looking at the roots of storytelling, and specifically exciting storytelling. You only need stuntmen when you're doing exciting things, and then it shows like this montage at the very end of Buster Keaton movies, Harold Lloyd movies, all of these really amazing physical gags that people would do for real, and sometimes they would have stunt people and stuff like that. But after you've just seen this huge epic movie from modern filmmaking using practically all practical effects. That's something that Tarsem was very proud of in this film, is that there is very, very few digital effects in the film. And so it kind of is a testament to how far we've come and how we're still doing the same things, just on a different scale to this day. And, it kind of has that feel that, King Kong did. When King Kong from 2005, Peter Jackson kind of takes this really old film that had groundbreaking visual effects from its day and kind of retells the same story and says, look, we still love the same things. We still love the same excitement and visuals. We're just on a different plane with it now. And then transferring this love of storytelling from Roy to Alexandria, and then she had never heard of what movies were, or flickers as he calls them, and then she kind of transfers that into the movies that she watches to see him do his stunt person thing. So it's kind of this kind of ultimate transition from the origins of storytelling, oral storytelling, into this medium of filmmaking that is so special to so many people now, and is kind of I don't want to say like our primary storytelling medium nowadays, but it is one of the most popular ones in the current day. So it's kind of it's almost this metaphorical encapsulation of the beginning to the current era of storytelling in all of its forms, and how exciting it is no matter what form that you're experiencing it in. All right, so with all of that being said, let's move on to overall notes. And one of the things that we can kind of talk about, I guess to start off, is this thing that you've basically got to use if you're doing a movie about storytelling, and that is narration or voiceover, and this element of using that oral element of storytelling and fusing it in with the visual element of storytelling. And we've talked a little bit before about how these days narration and voiceover is a little bit frowned upon, depending on how it's done. But I think it's basically inevitable in these movies, and far from kind of detracting or kind of making this kind of cringy cringy element, it enhances the stories because, oral storytelling is so ingrained in the themes of all three of these movies that if we just kind of jumped straight from a shot of someone starting to tell the story to the story with not that kind of audio blend, it would be almost more jarring than entertaining.
Yeah. And of course, all of these films are discussing in some way, shape, or form the relationship between story and storyteller. And voiceover is, one of the ways that those two communicate directly in a very conscious way, because all storytelling is communication. But VO is one of the ways that you communicate directly and you're both aware that you're communicating directly, which is an important distinction because it makes you aware that you're hearing a story about a story, and all of these are to a certain extent meta films. And that they're commentaries on storytelling themselves.
And it also presents a lot of opportunities for humor. So, like specifically in The Princess Bride, you have the moment where Fred Savage interrupts the story to say, wait, no, there's no way that she marries Prince Humperdinck. And he's like, okay, just let me tell the story. And that's another part of him learning to trust stories, is to just kind of accept what you're told and then figure out how we got there as we go along. But then a couple minutes later, when it's like, oh yeah, it was all a dream, he's like, see, I told you, in voiceover as we're still watching the story. And the grandfather says, yes, you're very smart, shut up. And that movie is just endlessly quotable. But, that's another way that you kind of use that voiceover to keep those two elements, the story and storyteller, combined, and still throw in those little flares of humor.
Yeah, right? Like it opens up a whole new venue once you are free to accept that you are telling a story. And what's more, you're talking about telling a story.
Yeah. And The Fall does similar things where it will use kind of the voice that Lee Pace is using and transfer it onto a different character as we're getting back into the story with this kind of lip sync thing, and then it transitions into their voices in the story and stuff like that. But yeah, it's kind of this inherent quality that you have to have. And I think each of these kind of has fun with that, using the narration as to use an editing term that I think we've thrown down on the podcast, but I think it was a long time ago. Basically using an L cut, where you continue the audio from one shot underneath the video of another shot as it comes on. So, the story starts being told while we're watching the grandfather read the book. The video of inside the story comes on while his audio continues for a little bit until the story then takes over and starts telling itself.
And of course, today what we're talking about is mostly, again, the title of the episode is Tall Tales. These are fantasy films that are kind of about all stories in general, about storytelling in a certain way, about the act of stretching reality to become a larger tale than it really was, or just making up a story out of whole cloth that reflects reality in some way. But that being said, there are plenty of other fantasy types, genres, subgenres, if you want to call it that. I personally feel like all stories are fantasy, all films are fantasy to a certain extent, unless it's a documentary.
There's a great line in the big book of Wes Anderson, or whatever it's called, that you let me borrow that one time, Alex, where in the introduction the guy writes, all films are fabricated. Some are just more honest about it than others, which totally fits for Wes Anderson because he has that very storytelling and storybook quality to all of his movies. But it's equally true for all these things we've been talking about today.
Oh, yeah. And of course, some suggestions that we have for other fantasy movies, should you want to check them out, some of which we've already covered on the podcast.
Yeah, specifically films that revolve around telling stories and learning to trust those or not trust those, and where to draw that line.
Yeah. So, of course, there's Rashomon, which we've already had on the podcast before. which is all about the reinterpretation of stories. I can't believe I'm going to mention it, but Titanic.
Which is framed in more of a flashback structure, but also, I mean, essentially she's telling a story. And then there's also Secondhand Lions from 2003, which is a great movie where, you know, you've got the two uncles and the kid gets dropped off, and he's kind of learning these larger-than-life stories about his one uncle who, or I guess about both of them, who had these kind of swashbuckling adventures when they were younger, and then kind of transitions into him becoming a cartoonist at the end. So that has a lot of really great storytelling and also that kind of heartfelt family core to it, like Big Fish.
And then, of course, there's Life of Pi, which we've already talked about on the podcast, which is all about fantasy and storytelling as potentially a coping mechanism. I don't know. Well, you be the judge. And then The Little Prince from 2015, which is currently on Netflix, available. Which
Netflix
is, again,
original.
All about... It's not Netflix... Oh, God.
Well, the point is it's not leaving Netflix anytime soon.
Yes, the point is it'll be on there for a while. So yes, that's a story that's all about a story that is within the story being told to another character within the story.
And it's animated, so the fantasy elements get kind of...
Oh, yeah. No, it's gorgeous.
Elevated to the nth degree. So yeah, so if you're interested in more films, check out any of those. But Alex, next time... we kind of called an audible. We were planning to do one thing, and
they canceled Filmstruck, Jonathan.
There was a curveball this week.
They just canceled it.
Filmstruck has been a bastion of this podcast since we did our world tour over a year ago, where we were watching a lot of foreign films. You can go check that out on the blog. But yeah, Filmstruck was a streaming site that made, for the price of Netflix, made almost all of the Criterion Collection and also a huge selection of Turner Classic Movies and Warner Brothers Classic Movies available that, you know, you can't get anywhere else without just basically buying a disc. It made all these movies available to stream, and they are shutting it down as of the end of this month. So whereas we were going to talk about Jon Favreau, whom we both love, and we will definitely get to him another time on the podcast, we are going to switch gears and talk about a foreign director and kind of utilize Filmstruck while we still can. So we're going to be talking about a Polish director named Krzysztof Kieślowski. And we will have lots of fun saying that over and over and over again next time.
I'm sorry, Polish people.
But he has a trilogy of films called the Three Colors Trilogy, which are each of the films are called Blue, White, and Red. Blue from 1993, White and Red both being released in 1994. They're kind of a thematic trilogy that deals with the Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité motto of France. What's that called? I don't know. Mantra, whatever. So that'll be very interesting. Neither of us have seen any of the films, but I've heard that they are very good. So we will check back in 2 weeks with an update on that.
I always like distinct colors.
Yep. It's actually where where Edgar Wright pulls his three flavors concept from. The three colors is kind of a play on that.
Huh. The more you know.
Yeah, there you go. That's what we're here for.
All right, well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlinks.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
I love that both times that you almost mispronounced Lee Pace's name, it was different.
Really?
Yeah. I don't mean to interrupt the Lee Pace of this podcast.
Oh.
But you had those mispronunciations at a really unfortunate Lee place.
Oh my gosh.
That wasn't that funny of a joke. The Lee price of that joke might have been too high. You'd see my eyes roll, but you can't see my Lee face.
Oh my gosh. We better pick up the Lee pace.
There you go.
I want to slap your Lee face.
You can't. We're not in the same Lee place.
Is it now just like a Lee chase to see who can get the most? How do we end this with Lee Grace?
I don't know.